CAE is the world's largest civil aviation training provider. We have a huge network, 200 cross sites in 40 countries. We have about 13,000 staff. We have 65 flight training centres, and those range from active airfields with real aircraft to centres with simulation. And our largest simulator centre has 48 of the large sitting on 6 legs simulators, and when you want to put that into a cost context, they come into around $20 million each. But we're across multiple dimensions. So we do civil aviation, that's our core business, where we train approximately 130,000 pilots in a year. We have a military training section, which moves across various things. But for example, we do 95% of the US military's flight training, from fast aircraft to helicopters to heavy transport aircraft. And we have a large medical section, as it says there. We do 60 million plus hours of medical training per year. And one of the key things that CAE has, CAE wants to be a thought leader in the human factors, human element space, is we have a human performance council. That human performance council brings people together from all elements of CAE's divisions across the spectrum, where we're able to learn from each other, present problems from our sector into other sectors, and listen to the solutions that they have. And it's a combination of practical deliverers, experts from the sector, as well as academic experts who provide the underpinning knowledge to it. So there's always a comparison I get. So part of my job in CAE is to act as a translator between aviation and maritime, or maritime and aviation. And when we first started HPX, there was a lot of questions. So how do you do this in maritime? Do you have this? And I go, no. Do you have this? Not really, no. What about this? No. And they're sort of like, well, how do you actually do it? I said, I don't know, 4,000 years of practice, I think, is where it comes down to it. So I always used to say, the only similarity between an aircraft cockpit and the bridge of a ship is windows and people. There are a few knobs and buttons, but that's about where it ends. Everything under there is different. And lots of the things that aviation does, or the way it does them, it's learned the hard way. We have a saying, aviation knows how it does what it does now because it's paid for the learning experience in blood. We try not to pay twice. Not always the case, and we don't get it right. People look at aviation and say it's a perfect situation. It's not, but we know it's not. And therefore, we're always actively looking to learn from what goes wrong, why it goes wrong, and how we can change it. It constantly evolves. So, one of the key things is the regulator. The regulator in aviation has real teeth. You imagine operating your company and somebody saying, if you've got this piece of equipment fitted, you can't go to sea. This is what happened with the Boeing 737 MAX 8. They were grounded globally for the best part of 24 months. Now, there's a load of them parked up that all belong to one airline. Imagine you're operating when they say, you know the thing you've got that you burn most of your money with, you can't use it. Live with it. So the regulator is powerful and effective and has safety as its bottom line. It doesn't care about the commercial aspect, it's only interested in the safety aspect predominantly. There's also the concept of the accountable manager in aviation. The accountable manager is an individual in an airline who is accountable to the regulator. And this is not just somebody you pick. The regulator has to vet them. They get interviewed by the regulator, and if the regulator feels that they've got areas where they're lacking, then they'll add additional oversight and additional audits to the operation to ensure that it's safe. They're responsible for the safe delivery. They must ensure that all of the activities are adequately financed and that the regulations are complied with. And if they don't, the regulator's knocking on their door and asking them why. So there's this individual who's appointed/approved by the regulator to ensure safety. There was a question about standardisation. Standardisation is core to the way aviation manages to do what it does. The equipment is standardised. If you look at an aircraft type, across all of the ones, 99 roughly %, they're identical, which means that you can train pilots to deal with situations across an aircraft type. Most airline pilots will carry one type rating. They are legally allowed to fly commercially one aircraft. Now, if you look at some airlines, such as EasyJet, they only own one type of aircraft. So scheduling for them is easy, because all of their pilots can fly all of their aircraft, because they're all the same. All of their maintenance staff, who are also certified and regulated, can maintain all of their aircraft, and they only need one box of spare bits. So that's it. And we facilitate all of their flight training in our centre in Gatwick. Training for pilots is standardised. Doesn't really matter where in the world you train, about the only difference is the language that you might train in. But then they're all required to speak an adequate level of English. So pilot training is consistent across the world. It's not up to national variations based on historical precedent. ICAO says this is how you train pilots. And that's the end of it. And then finally, procedures. Airlines are very keen that their procedures are standard. So everybody knows the procedures, how to apply them. We can train on the procedures. We can train on standard equipment. So this high level of standardization allows lots of training. As Heather said in her presentation, when dealing with emergencies, we can practice emergencies in lifelike situations. And if you've ever had the opportunity to go into one of our full mission flight simulators, it's like being in the real thing. And for one, it's quite small up there. It's not as big as you think. It's quite cozy at the front, even of a big aircraft, because everything has to be in reach, and the pilots train for that. Type rating is another one people talk around. As I said, pilots can usually only fly one aircraft type, possibly two, depending on the airline. This is based on equipment standardization. If everything you see in front of you is always in the same place, now I can start to train you to work and respond to it. There is a theoretical element to type rating, where you learn the aircraft systems, you learn how its control and automation system works, and importantly, you learn how it fails. Which bits of the fancy technology stop working when various sensors fail. It's not foolproof, but it's pretty good. There's a skill test, and it requires renewal. You keep your type rating as long as you're flying that type of aircraft. If you want to change type ratings, depending on how big a change in aircraft it is, you're looking at somewhere between 3 to 8 weeks of training before you're certified to fly another one. And you don't just do the type rating course and go for it. You have to be signed off as an approved on the aircraft type. And this is checked, depending on the airline a little bit, but usually every 6 months. And they look at it holistically, not just your ability to fly the platform, but also your ability to work with your colleagues. In aviation, one of the key elements, as Heather sort of mentioned, is the swift trust concept. This is a trust in your colleagues that they can do the job, because unlike a ship where you might be on board for months and you've got time to get to know your colleagues, two pilots are going to turn up, and in a big airline they may never have met each other, and they're going to fly you to the destination. So they better know what they're doing, and they better be able to trust each other. So they have a natural trust in their colleagues that says, you're not sitting next to me, doesn't matter which way round it is, unless you've been through the same learning and certification process that I have, and that you can do the job. Therefore, I can trust you, because they have a trust in the system, and the system is based on a foundation of standard training, standard procedures, and standard systems. Standardization is key to driving it forward. Competency checks, minimum of annually, but usually in any responsible airline, they're every 6 months. They test both the technical skill of a pilot and also their ability to use the human factors tools. And if you can't, you don't go flying. You don't go back into the line, as they call it, and you don't fly with passengers behind you. And there's processes for addressing and correcting any failings. But they don't let people go out and go, they're sort of okay. Sort of okay is not good enough. You have to be able to do it, or you're not going to do it at all. Crew resource management, and I won't spend a lot of time on this because Heather dealt with it so admirably, but it's embedded in all training and operations, whether it's pilots, whether it's air traffic control, whether it's maintainers, whether it's ground operations, human factors. It requires recurrent training. Pilots have to redo their human element, human factors, crew resource management annually. If you change within An airline, if you get promoted, you do it again. If you change aircraft types, you do it again. If you change automation systems, do it again. They like doing it, but it's a minimum of annually. And it's continually evolving. We're on version or iteration 6 of it. And they're constantly looking at things pilots are having difficulty with, developing training solutions and implementing it. It's not a dead thing, it's constantly evolving. Checklists. Checklists is one that kind of gets to me a bit. Checklists support the crew and they support operations. They aid decision making by getting you to do the standard stuff consistently. They're a quality tool. They are not an audit tool. Pilots do not sign a checklist. They do not tick a box. They require, if there's an audit element to it, it's the voice recorder. And depending on the aircraft type, that can be the last 2 hours. So they base it on the basis that pilots have been trained to follow it. When you go to flight school, on day 1, they hold up a checklist and say, this is a checklist. If you do not follow this, you will die. And for the next 14 months, that's pretty much every morning. This is a checklist, you must follow them. It's not a perfect system, and it does lead to some problems, but it is the most reliable way of ensuring pilot consistency. And pilots have been using it since the 40s. And pretty much if you look at a checklist from the 40s and a modern checklist, they're almost identical. They're not training tools, they're pilot support tools to enable pilots to do difficult things when their life is on the line. If it's all going wrong, this is not some remote thing that might happen. You might fall out of the sky, therefore they won't. Before an aircraft takes off, they will have developed about 1,400 different checklists. And by takeoff, I mean this is the first time it lifts its wheels off the ground from a new design. About 1,400 checklists are required by regulation to be there, to have been done and have been verified. Safety reporting and the just culture. Safety reporting is critical to aviation safety. And it's whether it's flight operations, technical maintenance and repair, navigation services, or aerodrome and ground services, you report. So if anything goes wrong, you report it. In fact, if something goes wrong and you don't report it, there are much more severe sanctions, because it's all part of feeding into the learning process that is key to the industry's safety. Line operator safety audit. A check pilot sits behind you and watches what you do. It feeds the learning culture, and the learning culture feeds the training. So it's a constantly evolving process. And what they look at is not an individual failure. You forgot to do something, you didn't do something. We're all human. It's bound to happen. They're interested in why, and they're interested in if there are multiple incidents of it. If numerous pilots flying, doing roughly the same thing and making the same mistake, it's not the pilots, it's the system, and then we need to change the system. So they go back and they tweak the system. And there's a saying, if you're in doubt about something, you should report it, because there are no sanctions, or very minimal sanctions. If you're constantly forgetting to put the wheels down, your airline will be having a conversation with you and trying to figure out why. But it's about learning from what people do. Now, those are all sort of things that could be translated into maritime. And there's been mooted the concept of air traffic control, particularly around headlands with separation schemes, that you could cut some miles, save some fuel, greenhouse gases, by routing ships based on the traffic density. The Mona Lisa project is an example of this. The problem with that is you're missing the third dimension. So airfields, aerodromes, airports are controlled airspace. So you can't just go wandering into them. There's controlled separation when you're in, and the thing is the third dimension. About 10,000 feet, general aviation operates below that, and as long as it doesn't go into the controlled spaces, you can keep your eyes open, don't fly into the other aircraft. Above that, that's where air traffic control comes in, and air traffic control manages the traffic. And as Heather and I were discussing earlier, if there's an emergency, if you declare a mayday, then air traffic control will route other aircraft around you to create a priority for you to land to mitigate your emergency. And that's it. Thank you very much.